For those of you new to Operation Parent, welcome. For those of you who've been with us for a long time, we're glad you're back. We are a nonprofit organization with a very simple mission: empowering parents and caregivers to have casual, courageous conversations with their children. That mission is why we offer these webinars, to provide practical tools, expert guidance, and support so families can navigate life's challenges with confidence. Today, you're here for Mind Over Media, supporting kids' mental health and behavior online, with Dr. Dave Anderson. We couldn't be more thrilled, and I'm happy to tell you a little bit about him. Dr. Dave Anderson is a Vice President of Public Engagement and Education and a Senior Clinical Psychologist at the Child Mind Institute. During his 11 years, Dr. Anderson has directed the ADHD and Behavior Disorders Clinical Center in New York. He founded Child Mind Institute School and Community Programs Division and now leads the brand ambassadorship and national program dissemination efforts. Programs directed by Dr. Anderson have impressively reached over 2.4 million youth, educators, and parents, just what Operation Parent loves to hear, in New York, California, as well as nationwide. Dr. Anderson's career has been dedicated to reducing the stigma associated with mental health and learning disorders. And as a parent of 2 daughters with ADHD, I really value his work in that area and increasing access to mental health support and treatment, particularly in settings where their services are typically less available. Dr. Anderson currently lives in Connecticut with his wife and 2 children who are 9 and 6, and we could not be more happy to be with him today.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for that kind introduction, and great to be with you all today. What I'm excited to go through is, and the piece that's kind of there on the end of my bio is that the thing that I get most excited about within this field, outside of treating patients and being able to make sure that programs reach, kids and support youth mental health across the country, is being able to, communicate science-based information about youth mental health to large parent or educator audiences, and to make sure that people walk away with practical steps. So to that end, I'll get to some of our learning objectives 2 slides from now, but let me kind of move on to tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from here. So the Child Mind Institute, we are a 500-person nonprofit with offices in San Francisco, New York, and Athens, Greece. Our focus is on providing care to, at this point, over 15,800 patients from 45 nations, 49 states, and Washington, D.C. to date. We're about 15 years old. And we provide that care in our home offices in and around New York and California, and then in high-need schools and around our home offices. More than 3/4 of the kids that travel to us to receive care or receive care in our local community receive care with free reduced cost services. Secondly, we take that kind of care that we provide and we try to use it to fuel public education initiatives and dissemination of capacity building both nationally and globally. So what that means, as Michelle referenced, is that we partner with school districts across the country. We partner with politicians, legislators, governors, and others all across the country to bring youth mental health services to their communities, think about how we develop the youth mental health workforce, do internships for high schoolers to give them exposure to clinical careers, bring digital therapeutics and digital tools to augment and amplify the effects of therapy across the country, and then also work across 9 low and middle income countries as part of our global programs. Our website, childmind.org, plays host to over 2 million visitors each month and offers hundreds of articles on all kinds of topics, including the one that I'll be speaking about today. And then beyond that, we have a very large research division that focuses on bringing kind of youth mental health into its next stage of evolution through brain research, collection of very large-scale data sets on over 8,000 youth, looking for objective markers of mental health and learning disorders beyond the questions that a clinician might ask in an interview, and also championing big data and open science, meaning that we share our data and all the data that we collect on youth openly with researchers across the world, as long as they pledged not to try to re-identify anyone in our data sets. And that what that has meant is that over the course of our existence, we have seen over 1,300 articles be published by researchers in over 3,000 cities worldwide on our data, where we ourselves have only really published a few hundred articles on our data. So that's kind of the pillars of the Chalmers Institute's work, and something like this, getting science-based, credible information to parents with practical steps they can take away for caring for their kids. Same thing for educators and communities. This is why we want to partner with an organization like Operation Parent today. So with that, our key takeaways, things that I'll be focusing on over about the next 46 minutes. We want to make sure that when we give a talk about this, there is a lot of media messaging that comes through about screens and about their effect on youth. So I want to make sure to give kind of a state of the science on how screens, and particularly social media, which is a very, very hot topic within screens, do influence youth mental health and behavior, and what the research says about that. I want to help any attendees here who interact with kids in their lives to come away with some really practical strategies for age-appropriate boundaries on digital use. And that's going to mean that I actually go through developmental stages and talk about tech considerations for each of those stages once we get a little bit past kind of the state of the science and cutting through some of the zeitgeist. And then beyond that, talking a bit about how we engage with youth and with families around checklists that focus on the overall kind of landscape developmental factors that contribute to healthy youth development, and how that entails sort of safe and balanced engagement with digital tools. So hope you'll come away with all three of those things today. And I want to preface by saying that the next slide is quite jarring, and it's meant to be. So when we start with kind of the state of the science around technology, I often start with a slide like this. It's actually a collage that my wife made. She is a professor of neuroscience and psychology at Yale. Her name is Dylan G. And she is particularly involved in studying some of the effects of tech in a large kind of nationwide multi-site study that I'll also mention on the next slide. But when we think about kind of the talks on tech and what messages parents, caregivers, and educators are getting, these are the headlines. And for those of you who understand the word clickbait, that is what we often see, is that the headline is meant to get you to click on the article. It's not necessarily meant to be the best representation of the science. So if we can form a headline that kind of validates a fear that a parent has, and at the same time promises either confirmation of that fear or a solution for that fear, that's going to be the perfect clickbait. And I don't fault media for putting kind of sensational headlines on things. It's a competitive environment. It's both informational and capitalist. And so the idea is get more people to read your stories. So if we can ask a question where the answer may actually be no, we can still get people to click on it, because after all, they do want to answer that question, and parents want to figure out, what is it I can do to make kids most healthy? So we have these headlines. This is kind of like what parents often see in terms of the intensity of what grabs their attention around technology and kind of contributes to a level of panic. And then we have how we study technology. So here I've included just some of the most prominent groups across the United States studying technology, youth, and the developing brain. So for example, the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study is actually a study across 17 states of over 11,000 youth, tracking them from age 9 or 10 longitudinally, and making sure that we can collect data on all kinds of different influences in their development, not just technology, but all kinds of different factors. And the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study has been releasing their data as they come up with it, as well as making sure that to make their results public as they look at technology as it relates to youth mental health and in line with many other factors. The second one that I have here in kind of the middle top row is a lab at Oxford that famously looks at video games and violence in video games, and particularly kind of males' interaction with technology, as well as overall time spent on screens and how that relates in research. The thing on the kind of the top right on this row is the Chalmers Institute's It's a longitudinal study of 8,000 youth, collecting data on all kinds of factors involved in their development, and that's a data set that we share openly with the world. On the bottom row is a lab at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, led by Eva Telzer, that also collaborates with a lab led by Mitch Prinstein, the Chief Science Officer for the American Psychological Association, looking at tech and youth. The middle is a lab at Wellesley, run by Linda Charmaraman, who's a fantastic psychologist who will be featuring on Child Institute's Thriving Kids podcast, an upcoming episode early in 2026. And then the next lab is Sophie Chukas Bradley's lab out of Pitt, that really looks at teens and young adults and their interactions with social media. These are just a selection of the ongoing research studies across the country. One of the things that's really difficult in kind of sifting through the state of the science on youth and technology and what we talk about in kind of our cultural zeitgeist is that there is a ton of data here. The studies that I've talked about here represent data on, 30 to 40,000 youth collected very recently, looking at the effects of technology in their mental health and looking at a host of other developmental factors. And what we tend to see in media and in kind of the narratives that reach parents are quick hits. We'll see parents get things from social media themselves, things they see on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, grabby headlines like you saw on a previous slide. And kind of the question becomes like, where does the science intersect toward actionable steps that parents can take, where we kind of map the risks that are known about in the research, but we also don't get sensational or don't oversimplify our solutions. And that's another major issue we have in the current cultural discussion, is that we tend to oversimplify the solutions. Believe me, as an avid reader of all the data on youth mental health and as someone who wants to devote their life to solving our youth mental health crisis, if the solution to solving the youth mental health crisis was as simple as putting the genie back in the bottle, that would be all I advocated for all day long. But it just isn't. And so that's where we need to get to the state of the science. So the state of the science requires us as parents, caregivers, educators, policymakers, community members, people who care about kids, to tolerate a certain number of things all at once. And it's tough because it means that we have to kind of tolerate the fact that these truths exist, perhaps somewhat independently, and at times may be a little bit difficult to tolerate at the same time, and to say that they can all be true. So a lot of this slide is me actually translating a colleague of mine, Dr. Candace Odgers at UC Irvine, her research and her messaging around this, where what we can think about is a number of things being independently true about technology. We are undoubtedly in the midst of a youth mental health crisis. Now, encouragingly, some of you may have seen headlines that there is research showing that there have been signs of improvement in this crisis over the course of the last year or two, and that we may be seeing some of the, particularly post-pandemic severity, decreasing, which is great. There's a host of hypotheses about why that is happening, and I can get into that in a future talk or something like that, but we're still in the midst of a pretty severe youth mental health crisis, no matter how you slice it. At the same time, when we look at the research, we take a balanced viewpoint and look at it, the consensus within the field of mental health is that while technology can be a contributing factor, an accelerator in certain vulnerable populations, while there are risks that we need to map, the research does not indicate that technology is the sole factor driving this crisis, nor even the main factor driving this crisis. What is true is that when you consider technology in amongst all other kind of developmental criteria, there are a wide range of things that if we are policymakers, we need to be paying attention to. And I get to this on a community-focused slide late in the presentation, but a wide range of things that we need to be focused on. Clear risks and benefits of youth technology use absolutely do exist. I will get into some of those later on in this talk. We definitely need to be holding technology companies' feet to the fire in terms of reforms and safety. And that is something where truly there is a large kind of, I think, national discussion around this. There are not enough guardrails. There need to be more guardrails. It doesn't mean social media is driving the youth mental health crisis, but it means that there are risks that we need to ask technology companies to be held accountable for, because the reality is the motivator for social media is different than health or wellness or entertainment. It is to keep eyeballs on it for as long as possible so as to push other content that might also be driving the profit model. So if that's the model for some of these things that youth are going to be exposed to, we have to really consider what the appropriate guardrails are. And those need to be ongoing discussions we have as a society. So that reform is definitely needed, but at the same time, making technology the boogeyman for the entire crisis is not necessarily in line with the science. We know that more research is needed, but we also know that the research indicates certain things that we really can take away from it and take practical steps as people who care about kids. And lastly, and this is what I hope you get from the rest of this talk, is that Our approach at the Childmind Institute at Operation Parent is that in the midst of all of these things that we see as risks for our children, forces that we need to think about as we raise children and raise children in our communities, we need to be focused on practicality. What we do each day to put one foot in front of the other and help our kids navigate this crazy world we live in, not a panic-based state that has us just yelling at kids about things that honestly decrease our credibility as caregivers for them. So with that, I'll get to one last kind of, framing aspect for a talk. And this is something that where I really do try to channel my wife and our dinner table conversations. When you're married to a neuroscientist, one of the things that you see often is the notion of brain-based narratives being brought to your dinner table. So frequently what's been found in media studies related to parents and caregivers is that when you mention the brain, whatever you say right after that oftentimes has higher credibility associated with it than if you were not to mention the brain at all. That is not to say that what you said about the brain was accurate. So one of the caveats that I want to provide in framing, discussions of technology is that frequently in media narratives, parents are fed this kind of thing of like, this is how technology changes the brain. Everything changes the brain. Our brain is plastic. It is particularly plastic when we are in a child or adolescent phase of development. And that plasticity also maintains itself throughout the lifespan. It is really important to ask the question, how does it change the brain differently, perhaps than other things, which may be a larger research question. But if someone just tells you it changes the brain, learning changes the brain, interactions with caregivers change the brain, play changes the brain, any reinforcing activity changes the brain and may activate reward circuitry and dopamine within the brain, which is often a thing that is referenced related to technology. The reality with all kinds of rewarding activities is they both change the brain. And for some of them, we definitely need to help kids to put boundaries around those rewarding activities because they would continue to engage in them at all hours of the day and at all times because of the nature of how rewarding they are. Whether it's tech-based or whether it's eating candy or whether it's in the case of my son watching NFL highlights until someone tells him that it's bedtime. Kids like to do rewarding activities. And so it's important not to kind of let brain-based statements cause us to panic even more. The reality is, we want to be thinking about how things might change the brain differentially, not just that they change it. So to get to the things that are inputs for our brains as we are, moving through childhood and adolescence, this is where we often center families in getting toward a discussion that is practical around technology. So what we'll highlight is there are key factors that show up over and over and over in developmental research that drive healthy outcomes for kids. So when we go through this checklist, oftentimes we want to put tech in context with this checklist. So we want to ask parents, how engaged is your child with school? Are they attending school regularly and appropriately? Are they engaged with school? How well do homework routines work? Are we making sure that we have distraction-free time in the afternoons as needed for their academic level developmental stage to make sure that they're getting homework routines? Are they involved in at least one extracurricular activity outside of school? It could be an activity that they stay at school afterwards for. It could be an activity outside school, a sports team, a music lesson, an acting class, a drawing class, a coding class, something that's just kind of getting all the neighborhood kids together for a more informal extracurricular chess club, whatever it might be. Our question is, are they engaging in real life interactions with the development of real life passions and hobbies? Do we have that at a minimum of one activity for any given kid in engaging with something outside school? We get a lot of questions about overscheduling. That tends to be a case-by-case basis for kids in terms of the number of extracurricular activities. It also tends to be about whether or not it's interfering with any other things on this checklist or whether it's negatively affecting a kid's mood. There might be kids like me when I was a kid who want to do all the things and are happy doing them. And there might be kids like a patient I had in my office here yesterday who pleaded with me to make sure there's at least one weekday a week where he just has chill time at home and doesn't have to do a particular thing. So we're always looking at that kind of in developmental context. But we know that a kid's school attendance and engagement, their engagement and development of, say, an extracurricular activity or hobby in real life are key factors in their wellness. Then we get to the basis, something I say to every patient who comes in the office where they say, look, I'm looking for cognitive behavioral therapy or exposure and response prevention or dialectical behavioral therapy. And I will say, I'm so glad you're looking for those things. Before I give you the tech of second or third wave mental health psychology, let's talk about your basic wellness practices. Because if we're not really tending to those, any newfangled thought, behavior, and feeling techniques that I might be able to give you might be less effective. And this is key for kids. So we'll say, let's talk about your sleep. Are you getting enough sleep? Are you getting to sleep okay? Are you sleeping throughout the night okay? Are you waking up at the hour that you'd like to wake up? Is the area where you sleep of a cool temperature, comfortable and dark, which facilitates good sleep hygiene for kids? Do you feel like you're getting enough sleep? Do you wake up feeling rested? Any of those things that we might be able to optimize. Are you moving your body in some way? Are you taking walks? Are you walking the dog? Are you walking to school? Are you engaged in a sport? Are you playing in the yard? Are you playing at the park nearby? How are you moving your body in any given week? That's a key factor in your health and your wellness. What does your diet look like? Are you getting regular meals? How nutritional are these meals? Is there any balance that we might need to think about to sustain your energy throughout the day and kind of the way that you eat? How are you hydrating? Are you getting enough water? Are you visiting the water fountain at school? Do you carry a water bottle with you? Those types of things that we know can immediately affect a child's mood or wellness if we're not paying attention to them. Are we getting face-to-face time with friends and family? For younger kids, are we seeing play dates? For older kids, are we seeing a friend group where we feel like we belong, or a friend that we feel like we belong and can spend time with outside school? That's a huge predictor of wellness, especially among teenagers, if you're looking at a teenager who's experiencing academic failure and peer rejection, major risk factor for substance abuse. And those things are things that we're always thinking about teenagers over and above technology in thinking about their kind of overall wellness. Do you feel included? Do you feel like you have a good friend? Do you feel like there's someone you can hang out with outside school? Is your family having a couple family meals a week? Are there times when you spend time with your caregivers in an activity you both enjoy? If people are answering yes to those questions, regardless of the quality of interaction with caregivers, that predicts high caregiver monitoring, that the kid believes that someone cares where they are, cares about boundaries and curfews and kind of their social life and their safety. That can be very predictive of their health and kind of avoidance also of other risky behaviors of adolescence. It's immensely important to ask those questions. Then we ask them about the use of screens in ways that we know can be beneficial for entertainment, for learning, or for connection. Are you using screens for that? How are you using screens for that? How does it help to augment your social life? Because that's very real for this generation, is that their social life is divided between IRL or in real life interactions and digital interactions. And it's really important for us to honor that and not necessarily diminish, invalidate, or dismiss the value of a vibrant online social life and a vibrant in real life social life. The reality is this is also preparing them for the modern workplace. If you don't understand email tone, emojis, ways of communicating on Slack or Teams or chat or things like that, that could actually leave you unprepared for the modern workplace. So there are lots of things about that socializing that also prepare kids at appropriate ages for those kinds of transitions. We want to ask kids if they have something that they consider a hobby or a passion that they are cultivating. It doesn't have to necessarily be because they attend a chess club. Maybe they're learning chess online or reading a book about it. It doesn't have to be that they have piano lessons. They could be fiddling around with a keyboard that's left over from an older sibling in the house and kind of figuring that out. But it's seeing kids engage with life and kind of develop these hobbies. Appropriately, especially as kids get older, are they doing chores? Are they earning allowance? As they get past age 15 or 16 in certain states, do they have a job where they're kind of getting some work experience either during the school year or over the summers? And considering kind of how important that is for development to have those experiences. And lastly, and I'll talk about this on kind of a later slide related to technology, what are their mental health vulnerabilities? Are they a kid who struggles with their mood? Do they struggle with anxiety? Do they struggle with focus or their behavior? Have they experienced trauma or significantly challenging life events? And how do we kind of figure that in? Once we get that entire landscape, it's incredibly important to think about that entire landscape and what time they have left for screens. Once we're kind of trying to check off all these boxes, how they spend their time on screens. Does it fall into the yellow box here? For those of you who might not be seeing yellow, the box that says positive social contact via screens. Is it falling into one of the more beneficial categories? And is it infringing on any of the things in here? oftentimes the biggest conflicts that we see between parents and kids around screens are these moments when the kids are using screens in such a way that interferes with homework, or it interferes with sleep, or parents are worried they don't have real life interactions. And that's where we seek this kind of balance, where we say, okay, let's not demonize screens entirely to your kid and say you should never be on them, but let's take a look at the technology considerations across development that I'm about to go through, kind of consider where they are, consider what's appropriate for kind of their peer group, and then build their digital literacy in line with this particular wellness balance as much as we possibly can. And that might also inform where we place the boundaries on technology. So getting into some of those considerations across development, because that technology balance checklist I just went through, that's the most important slide I'll talk about today. If there's any slide to come back to and ask yourself questions about or rewatch a portion of the presentation, it was that portion. That's why I try to make sure it's up front. But now we're getting into kind of the nuances, depending on the age of the children in your life. So when we talk about preschool years, and for many of you, you might be visiting the American Academy of Pediatrics website, the AAP, which is also linked at the end of this presentation. These folks have been the real leaders from early on in kind of the digital age of setting up recommendations that are research-based on screen time for early ages. And you might notice that I haven't included infant and toddler years here, but if you go to the AAP website, you'll see this notion of kind of minimizing screen use in those years, because there's really, really important developmental tasks like learning gross motor, fine motor, expressive and receptive speech, tasks of that stage of development that are really important to develop through real life interactions. And so for that reason, you'll see recommendations about minimizing screen use, and also making sure that, there was kind of a pandemic caveat of perhaps using Zoom or FaceTime to contact relatives at a distance, which of course we don't necessarily think is harmful. We think is a tool for connection for kids. As we get into the preschool years, again, we're still considering screen time boundaries in line with the displacement of important developmental tasks. So at ages 3 and 4, kids need to be outside, kids need to be playing, kids need to be developing real life interactional skills. They need to be exploring. They need to be testing the limits of their bodies and their gross motor function. They need to be testing their expressive language. So what we want parents to really be thinking about is going back to that kind of checklist on the previous slide. What's really important at age 3 or 4? Not necessarily thinking that screen time is wrong if we're talking about high quality, perhaps learning focused educational or kid friendly content for the preschool age years. Kids might be spending some time watching that content with you as a mediator, but at the same time, we really do want to think about how we can make sure that we're balancing that with their important developmental tasks. We also want to be thinking, starting at this age, what are we modeling as adults? Are we putting our phone aside at dinner? Are we putting our phone aside at playtime? Do we appear to be distracted by the phone at these times? Kids naturally gravitate to whatever they think captures their parent or caregiver's attention. If we are focused on those things, but telling them that they should not be focused on them, that ends up being a sort of hypocritical messaging that they kind of figure out at even the earliest of ages. The other major thing at age 3 and 4 is just that we want to make sure that we carefully consider what kind of content we think is going to be amusing or entertaining to a 3 or 4-year-old, or educational to them, helping them to kind of navigate life situations. That's why in this age range, you see Blue's Clues and Bluey and Barney and these kinds of things, where it's really more about like kids learning about relevant stories, oftentimes through songs, or in, say, our curriculum, Healthy Minds, Thriving Kids Pre-K, which is freely available on our website, where we're trying to teach kids how to navigate different social situations at these ages through the media that they're watching. Or it might be related to their interest. My son at this age, who's 9 now, just wanted to watch truck time songs, talking about various trucks that he really liked. Or my daughter just wanted to watch songs and kind of fanciful content about unicorns and mermaids at age 3 and 4. And that can be really, nice just to kind of be able to watch with them. As we go to the early elementary school years, kids will start to engage with screens more independently. They may even figure out a little bit more about how to navigate screens a little bit. Your phone, a computer, things like that. They may not be necessarily adept at doing this. They can usually figure out how to work the TV at this age. But it's, again, a careful consideration of how we as adults maintain careful monitoring of what content they're exposed to, what they're watching, what themes are in that. That's why we have great rating systems for movies, not to mention Common Sense Media, a partner of ours, really does a great job in these age ranges of helping parents have a mapping of all kinds of content that kids could be exposed to and knowing kind of what themes you might see. There's also an important thing that I'll get into in the next slide about how we want to differentiate screen-based activities at these ages. Not all screen time is created equal. Watching a movie on a weekend with your early elementary school age kid is an activity that can be really bonding and also can provide you a lot of fodder for conversation about how, characters on screen are confronting different situations and what that means. Obviously, at this age, I shouldn't say obviously, but we are not necessarily saying you should have a kid age 5 to 7, say, in a separate space alone, like watching something by themselves where you can't necessarily moderate content or make sure there are content filters, or engaging in certain other activities. Like they might be trying to engage in certain games, or they might be trying to watch something on television. But as I'll discuss a little bit later in the presentation, there are real risks to other activities online at this age, and it's really good to set a boundary around those things and say, look, these are the ways that we can watch TV together. These are the ways that we might be able to use my phone together, but these things are off limits to you right now. As we get into late elementary school years, this is when we start to see some significant independence around screens. And one of the things we try to put in parents' minds at these ages is the old kind of behavioral phrase of I do, we do, you do. It's that as kids start asking to navigate things in the digital world, it's really helpful to demonstrate what we do. So in other words, I might say to my 9-year-old who's in this age range, I'm going to show you what I do on my phone, or I'm going to show you what I do on the TV, or I'm going to show you what I do on the computer. These are also the ages across public schools across the US where we tend to start seeing a significant increase in computer use in schools, where kids will start to use computers for typing, for learning, for differentiated kind of math practice, for maybe building their first presentations or research projects. So we don't want to necessarily run afraid from these things. These are important aspects of learning in a digital age, and we want to start kids early on this notion of, I want to engage with you on this. I want us to experience this together. This might be the I do phase of development where I show you what I do and how you can do this. And your engagement with screens might only be with me. Soon we might navigate this together and I'll give you a little more autonomy, but with me watching, which is the we do. And then eventually you might reach this stage where it's a you do, like in middle school, where you might be doing these things alone by yourself, certain activities on screens. I think the other thing that we want to highlight for kids is it's never too early to build in critical thinking. So to say to kids, listen, I want you to really think about the ways that different screen-based products you're interacting with. So if you're using it for learning, like if you tell me, for example, last night, my son is learning the cello in his school orchestra. He decided on that instrument for this year, and we've rented him a cello that we've already taken for repairs once. But he was really interested in seeing some cello videos by these folks called Two Cellos that play amazing rock songs just with two cellos and a drum. And my wife and I kind of looked at each other and said, okay, this is kind of entertainment and it's a little bit of learning. It's actually fostering this passion and this hobby that he has. And so as he's watching this, but then sees another kind of like video that wasn't necessarily educational, we said, no. We said you could watch a couple cello videos with us. That's okay. Meanwhile, we might also see kids at this age say, I want to connect with my friends through this particular thing. And again, that might be through early age-appropriate video games, things like that. And I'll have a note on that later, but we really want to make sure that we are engaging in that world with kids, where if they do start to play video games, there are age-appropriate games. Chat rooms, and especially any contact with strangers at this age, is not age-appropriate. And that's the thing that we want to be really cautious about. Some of those features are built into games for this age range. That can be really dangerous for this age range, where the game might not necessarily be dangerous or might be something they can still engage with on play dates. So again, it's kind of knowing and being informed about the ways they're using screens at this age, and still making sure that kids are aware this is very much either an I do or we do kind of situation. Right after we get kind of, as we start to embark on the middle school age range, which is my next slide, I like to show this slide to remind people of all the different technology-based activities. I found in the past that when I talk about the kind of preschool to elementary age slide, folks forget that we're talking about all of this and not just, for example, social media, which I think is the most present in the parent zeitgeist. But if you look at what our kids are going to be doing on screens. And this is just a smattering, because I don't even include an AI box on here, which is a whole other frontier at the moment. But I expect that if I project forward for my son and daughter, when they get to be, let's say they're college age, they will be listening to music on something. They might be, designing things, using apps or doing kind of digital art. They're definitely going to be watching TV shows and movies through apps. They could be taking their own amateur videos, or actually even creating movies or something like that using apps themselves. They'll definitely be texting or messaging people. They'll probably be watching live streams of something. Reality is the number of live streams we see, whether it's sporting events, video game players, people going on Instagram live for interviews, things like that. They may be watching some live events. They're probably going to be reading books or news through some digital medium. I still favor, actually being able to hold a physical book, but who knows if that'll be the preference of the next generation beyond millennial parents. They're probably going to be using rideshare travel apps, Uber and Lyft, and possibly autonomous taxi cabs that are becoming more and more, prevalent in major cities across the country. They're going to be working in their workplace on shared documents and projects that are shared across, these kind of different services. Today, it might be Google Docs or Teams or Monday or Slack, but those things are going to evolve. They're going to need to be able to do good internet searches, to be able to look through the initial AI summary and maybe look for additional information depending on the biases of AI. They may be playing video games. They may be using some sort of digital calendar or planner that allows them to coordinate with their partner, their friends, coordinate for their own kids, coordinate with work. They'll probably be listening to podcasts, hopefully ours, the Chalman Institute, Thriving Kids. But they also may be listening to all kinds of other stuff that fits with either their interest in sports or politics or just in general comedians talking. They might be part of online clubs or communities. Studies show that these can be enormously beneficial, particularly for kids who feel disenfranchised or excluded within their communities. They may be using AI tools like ChatGPT, but what I meant by the AI box is that that's only kind of the beginning of how AI might be integrated into all of these things over time. They're definitely going to be sending emails, hopefully sending emails to you, their parents, caregivers, perhaps educators or community members about the successes in life that they're finding and how much you played an incredible part and how grateful they are for you. They're probably going to be ordering food. They're going to be hopefully watching educational videos or courses, learning things through the amazing availability of things online. They may be on social media, connecting with people through, I don't even know what social media might be called, even in a decade's time, because much of the social media we have today did not exist about a decade ago. A decade ago, researchers were still doing research on MySpace. And now I think that's a distant memory. And they may be taking and editing pictures. So what's really important about this slide, the reason why I show it, is that as I get into the mention of digital literacy in middle school and high school in the next slide, I want parents, caregivers, educators, community members to have this slide to come back to say, oh my gosh, these are all the things that are part of being a digitally literate citizen of the world today. Not all of these things are equally risky. Many of them we wouldn't necessarily assign too much risk to at all. Now, granted, a generation ago, parents might have said that listening to rock music in your room was a really big risk, and that it was giving you certain ideas. Today, we might not index that as much of a risk. A generation ago, video games were part of a huge debate amongst parents about whether or not those video games would link to risk down the line. That research has, for the most part, been kind of a nothing burger. So what we want to be thinking about is that, certain risks that we might think about today may not be as big of a risk later on, and kids are going to be living in this full scope digital world. So as much as you might be thinking, okay, the national dialogue is about social media, that's where I need to focus my energy, there's a lot of places to focus in terms of digital literacy as kids get older. So that's where we get in the middle school years and the high school years. What I often say is that there's a lot in the national discussion about age ranges, where people will say, look, you want to delay giving your kid a phone until this age. You want to delay giving social media until this age. And what I often liken that to is kind of saying, like, look, I didn't wake up at 16 able to drive a car. I had to learn that. Competency-focused approaches generally help people navigate situations better in almost any challenge of childhood. We want kids to be competent to handle situations that might be exposed to drug and alcohol. We want kids to be competent in being able to be safe, considerate of their partner and able to think about consent, and also thinking about their family values or faith community when they're engaging in romantic relationships and thinking about sexual intimacy and physical intimacy. We want kids to have a competency-focused approach when they are engaging with community stressors, where they have certain coping competencies with prevention programs from their youth that they've thought about. Here's how I fill my cup. Here's how I care for mental health, even as things in my community are stressful, or I'm confronting stressors academically or with friends or wherever that might be. It's the same thing with tech. We want to think about how we make it so that we feel safe letting them drive the car. And that means a lot of different conversations and co-experiencing of the digital world. We want to emphasize starting in middle school that we are allowing them increased independence, but with high parental monitoring, and that this is a social contract between parents, caregivers, and child. As they demonstrate they can be responsible for these things, that's how they get more independence. That's true of their social life in these years. That should be true of their digital life. That's the general social contract of adolescence. We also want to engage in conversations about risks. There are certain risks we might make kids aware of in the early elementary school years and late elementary school years, like saying, I want you to think about privacy if you're playing a video game that has a chat and not talking to anybody whose identity you can't verify, things like that. But as we get into middle school years, there are a lot more risks to index, and I'll get into those in a couple slides. We also want to emphasize, especially middle school, that the default for kids' engagement with the online world should be privacy. It is private. They're only in contact with friends or people that you approve them to be in contact with. And, we may or may not choose to share with them all the fears we have about why that privacy needs to be there. But that's a great way of beginning to navigate the digital world, is to say, your default is privacy. Talk to me if you're trying to move beyond that. As we get into the high school years, kids are going to find ways around many of the boundaries that parents set. So we try to talk to parents about maintaining explicit open lines of communication, letting your kid know explicitly, listen, I have my rules. I want you to obey my rules. At the same time, if you get into trouble, I want you to talk to me. And for some parents, I'll add the statement, the consequence will always be less if you talk to me first than if I find out about the trouble myself. That's how you keep an open line of communication with teenagers, is that it's difficult because it also requires us to kind of hold two sometimes conflicting things in mind, where we're saying to the teenager something like, I don't want you to use drugs or alcohol, but also if you get into a really troubling situation with alcohol or with drugs, call me first. I want to make sure I'm there for you. I may still ground you for a few weeks. I may still tell you can't see these friends or can't go to this type of party, but I can promise you that I will help you out of this and that hope is not lost. I say that to parents constantly because I cannot tell you the number of teenage patients I've seen in my office who are so scared sometimes of disappointing their parents that they see no way out and they become hopeless in navigating certain developmental challenges. And we don't ever want teens to be in that place, because that is when they engage in the most impulsive and risky behavior. We want to keep emphasizing during these years the social contract of giving them increased autonomy with a behavioral demonstration of responsibility, and to think about how we monitor their texts or their communications, how we monitor their social media, how we monitor their communication with friends or their video game playing, and say, like, look, here's how I'm going to check in on this. Here's what I need you to do to educate me so I can be your kind of digital neighbor. And just like I want to know where you go when you go out, who you're going to be with, and I want to set the time that you're going to come home, there are also going to be rules that I set for your autonomy in a digital space, and you need to obey those particular rules. One of the biggest conflicts, as I talked about earlier, is that what the research shows that screens for teenagers in particular can really infringe on sleep. That this generation is having a lot more difficulty sleeping as much as they need to, partly because of the ubiquitous kind of presence of screens in our lives. And so it's not necessarily the screen's fault, but it's one of the reasons why we want parents from the get-go to be thinking with teenagers about how they are, as much as we possibly can, keeping devices out of rooms, and particularly keeping devices, computers or televisions or anything like that, out of a teenager's room as much as we possibly can. So beyond that, I will also just say that this is true of all adolescents, and it's really important. Be curious and interested, validating the importance of growing up in the age that they're living in. The more that we can honor, and I just talked about this recently on our most recent podcast episode with Lisa D'Amour, the more we can honor the fact that adolescence is a vibrant age of development, not be adultist, patronizing, or lectury about it, or say that we've navigated all these challenges, so we minimize whatever stressors they've got. The more we can avoid those things and be curious and interested in what they're experiencing in that phase of development, the more likely they are to bring us along for the ride and kind of let us in. If we say to them that we are immediately disapproving, we overreact, we get very angry, or we get dismissive, or we say, none of this matters, you don't know what, should matter, that kind of thing, we see an adolescent shut down. Just be curious. If you can be curious, you often see over time as you practice that, an adolescent will let you in a little bit more information. And then if you can just keep yourself regulated as you hear that information, and then think, how do I just say, thank you for sharing that with me? Are you looking for any advice or problem solving? If we can follow that kind of playbook, we talk about this a bit more on the podcast, the more likely adolescents are to open up to us. The last thing is I want to say that we want to be on the lookout for signs and symptoms that a teenager is struggling. And I'll talk in a couple slides just about how much we might consider the tech experience as an accelerator for teens who are particularly vulnerable to mental health difficulties. But when you ask, how would a teen be struggling? Changes in mood, changes in how irritable they are. Now, granted, teenagers tend to have a bit of an attitude, but what we tend to see is kind of a stark change in how irritable or how reactive they might be. Changes in sleeping habits, eating habits, withdrawal from activities that they once liked, withdrawal in general from certain activities, feeling hyper anxious about situations that seem like they shouldn't be, big developmental challenges, and as well, like teens who evidence a lot of hopeless or negative thinking, or talking about kind of minimizing their value in different situations. Those are all kind of red flags that we want to kind of be on the lookout for related to teenage safety and mental health challenges. So getting to a last little note on teens before I go into some of the risks we want to make sure that parents and caregivers are aware of. We often get as a question based off of kind of the considerations developmental stage is how a teen's afternoon should be structured. And really, these are the three things that we will often say, and I include this slide as just kind of a key kind of reminder for any parent, caregiver, or community member who's watching this presentation. Extracurriculars, time with friends and family, and homework come before screens. And we can often decrease a lot of the conflict around screens if we make this consistent messaging to teens from early ages in saying, I want you to be invested in your homework and your academic performance, in your extracurriculars and in your time with friends and family, and I will put limits on screens in the afternoons as much as I might need to make sure you're engaged on these things, and then put limits on them on the back end to make sure they don't infringe on sleep. If we can help do that for our teenagers and kind of get them on board with this messaging, we're generally getting at some of the big drivers of their wellness and well-being. Now, I've referenced this slide a couple times in the presentation. So the next two slides before I get into kind of like final thoughts here are about the risks that we really need to be aware of and also be able to communicate effectively with kids and teens about. So what I've included here as a graphic is this former Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, did put out an advisory following from his advisory in the youth mental health crisis 2 years earlier on social media and youth mental health. Now, for many people, when they saw this advisory, what was covered in the media was the notion that if an advisory is, issued, that must mean that this thing itself is a massive, massive risk and the cause of so many of these things that we see. The advisory was actually quite balanced in the sense that it said, look, here's what we know about the risks, here's where more research is needed, and here's what people can do. And it's quite to the point. But it really was a good kind of cross-section of the state of the science at that time, 2 years ago. And a lot of the research from that point has kind of built on this in the sense that what the research has shown is that when we look at research, not all screen time is created equal. And researchers have a lot of complaints about this notion that like overall screen time is used as a construct, because as we've discussed, if you're watching a movie with your family, it's very different than spending 2.5 hours alone in your room, doing something else perhaps. So what we want to be aware of is that what the research shows just in general, bluntly, is that there is significant risk associated with excessive screen use. And what I mean by that is, more than 3 or 4 hours a day that kids are on screens. And when we look at that, again, what I always pivot people back to in managing that risk is the developmental checklist slide that I showed early in this presentation, where what we want to be able to do is go back to that and say to the youth in our lives, how are we balancing all these things we know to be key factors in your well-being? And then on the back end, what we'll find is that we can generally reduce overall screen use if we're worried that a child or teen is using it too much, because we've said, I'm going to place boundaries on this till this other stuff gets accomplished. And then that really does reserve screens perhaps for their appropriate role as entertainment, learning, or connection, and not so much as a developmental replacement for so many key developmental tasks. As I've already referenced a couple times this talk, privacy considerations are huge across, even when we talk about things that late elementary schoolers would access all the way up through high school, where we worry about predators online. We worry about people in chat rooms. We worry about people who would catfish kids, who ask for inappropriate images, all kinds of different ways that kids will create fake accounts and then engage in different behaviors with peers. We want to make sure that as we engage in online spaces, we're talking to people we know and we're not talking to people that we don't know. I will say there is one caveat to that, which is that, as I said before, there are clear benefits for kids who may not find a certain sense of belonging and inclusion in their local real life community to find communities online where they can belong. That said, there are lots of ways to approach that safely and with identity verifications that also consider these privacy considerations. We want to make sure kids are aware the same issues that happen in real life, exposure to hate speech, harassment, and cyberbullying. Same things they might experience on the playground, same things they might experience in their school hallways also happen online and can be incredibly mentally injurious. And we want them to come talk to us if any of those things are happening. And they can happen across different places. They can be death threats on video games. They can be comments on social media. They can be text chats where kids are included and not included and then badmouth in the chat. And, they kind of see the insults or other people forward them screenshots. There's a lot that can go on. And the key is to talk to your kids about what that looks like, to differentiate for them between the notion of kids just being mean and what bullying really looks like and how much you want to support them around that. And then to also think about how to engage other community members in being as responsible as we can for what goes on in these online spaces, just like we are responsible for monitoring kids on the playground. I've mentioned this a number of times in the presentation already, but we really want to be mindful across development of what content kids are being exposed to. One of the biggest concerns as kids go into the teenage years and start to go on social media is whether or not they're going to be exposed to harm-promoting content that promotes, say, self-harm or promotes, say, eating disordered behavior, whether or not they're going to be exposed to violent content, things like that. At earlier ages, it might be very scary content or very adult content. Being content monitors throughout your kids' development is a really important task of a parent or a caregiver. As I just referenced, content that promotes harmful behaviors is another real concern online. It's one of these things to hold tech companies' feet to the fire about their own accountability on this. As I've already referenced in the presentation, the Surgeon General noted how much the research does support that screens, especially excessive time spent on screens, can affect sleep or exercise, basic wellness activities of childhood and adolescence. And lastly, there's a number of considerations in this report that I'll expand on the next slide related to pre-existing mental health vulnerabilities. So what I mean by that in terms of pre-existing mental health vulnerabilities is that almost every category of diagnosis across youth and child and adolescent mental health has some sort of interaction that's been mapped in the research with screens. Now, what's important is that the research does not indicate that the screens or screen-related behaviors are necessarily causing these mental health vulnerabilities. It is more that where pre-existing mental health vulnerabilities exist, there are interactions that could accelerate or cause the symptoms to become even more impairing. So where we see that as examples are when we see teens who are depressed. What we see is that more time spent on screens, particularly alone, particularly on social media, can engender social comparison effects. Everybody's having more fun than me, and also can lean into the behavioral deactivation, anhedonia, which is a loss of interest in things that used to be pleasant or reinforcing for you, and withdrawal that comes along with depression, in the sense that we will see kids where, look, a certain amount of bed rot, as the teens say, may be nice on a Sunday morning. But if you're depressed, particularly as we're entering the winter season, and spending a long period of time on screens in your bed, whether it's watching your shows or on social media or playing games, there's a tipping point where there's a real point of diminishing returns where it can exacerbate mood symptoms and become kind of a self-reinforcing cycle where we're withdrawing so much from life, we're actually reinforcing depression, causing ourselves to think more about how we're not engaged, real life activities won't be that fun, I'm losing friendships, it's not going to be worth it. And so that's where we want parents to be really cautious in understanding that, if your child is prone to depression and spending a ton of time on screens, that can be a reinforcing cycle where we want to intervene both on their depression, get them support there, and also place limits on their screen time while setting goals around how much we behaviorally activate for real life. We also see social comparison effects that can fuel anxiety, in the sense that kids who are anxious will often spend a lot of time monitoring their friends' activity online, trying to figure out if they're being included or not included, if other people's lives or closeness with friends is going better than them. And we have to get kids to think critically about how their activity online or their doom scrolling, for example, might be fueling or helping their own anxiety. We will sometimes see, particularly with obsessive compulsive disorder, a lot of times with obsessive compulsive disorder, we will see kids develop compulsions that are related to intrusive thoughts that can also be fueled by screens. Or we can also see that some of the checking behaviors that are associated with screens can be associated with some of their OCD symptoms, the sense they feel like they have to maintain these rituals each day, or else bad things will happen, or else they'll lose their friends, or there's certain anxieties kind of associated with that. So there's a number of different ways that obsessive compulsive disorder can also interact with screen-related behaviors. We have to kind of like disentangle that connection, usually with a trained professional. We also get concerned about body image and eating disorders. There is significant research on this, particularly in female populations, to suggest that the filters we have online, the editing we have online, the way that online experiences are curated can very much affect adolescent females' impression of their own body, of bodies in the real world, things like that, and also can relate to content that, might start off as nutrition-related content, but then eventually moves into content that's actually promoting unhealthy behaviors. And that's something we want kids to be aware is occurring, especially if they're vulnerable in this area. I specialize in working with kids with ADHD and behavior disorders. So these next two categories we see fairly frequently. It is very, very difficult for any kid with ADHD to engage in unfettered time in the afternoon that prioritizes homework or other major activities, chores, getting certain household tasks done when screens are also present. And so it's a frequent conversation with families of kids with ADHD where we have to say, look, their prefrontal cortex is not only developing, as it is with most kids, but also needs a ton of support during these stages of development. So just asking them to not watch YouTube and do their homework usually doesn't work. We often need a great deal of structure to be able to help them understand their symptoms, own their symptoms, and be able to prioritize the less reinforcing activities over the more reinforcing activities. With behavior concerns, a common thing where kids who have significant behavioral challenges or may throw tantrums or may get very angry with their parents, evidence that during screen transitions, when they're told to stop engaging with screens or do some other non-preferred task. And we're often coaching parents through ways of kind of making sure that either the screen-based activity itself is a reward for engaging in screens in an emotionally regulated way, or that there are other ways that we build up reinforcers and consequences to ensure that a kid understands that while we might not want to deprive them of what we would consider appropriate screen-based activities, that there are certain behaviors that are going to be off limits and unwelcome if they engage with those around screens, and it might require stricter boundaries. The last thing I'll get to related to mental health vulnerabilities before I go to the concluding slides here is autism spectrum concerns. So in that sense, when we look at kids on the spectrum, and just as one example, social and communicative difficulties can be really difficult for kids on the spectrum. They can prefer the online world to the real life one because that's more curated to them, can be more curated to their preferences. And so there's sometimes a balance of figuring out how to make sure that kids are developing the skills in the real world as compared to the kind of belonging or the kinds of curated experiences they might have online. Again, we don't want to deprive them of things they find really reinforcing or ways they might connect with peers online, but we want to kind of consider that balance and interaction of some of the skills they might have a little bit more difficulty developing and some of the scaffolding they need. So to get to our conclusion here before I move to 30 minutes of Q&A, I'll just say, I include this as the last slide before these what can parents do, what can educators do, and what can communities do slides, because I would just say, if you find yourself feeling fear, but also a lack of knowledge about any of the icons on this screen, I only chose a few here. I could have chosen 26 others. It's a really great idea to ask your kid to show it to you if they're at a developmental age that's appropriate for these particular things. Because there is such a rich world here that kids wade into. And all too often, parents have this kind of like go, no go idea with these worlds of saying like it's either no or yes. And in reality, there may be aspects of social connection within these, or aspects of entertainment, or aspects of learning within each of these things, but it has to be carefully cultivated in line with other aspects that we might consider to be more risky. And to learn these apps is to be able to map those effectively with your kid and help them to think about how they can critically think about their engagements online. So as we move to the Q&A, here are the thoughts I'd like to leave you with. If you are a parent watching this presentation, you say, what can I do as a parent? What are your final thoughts, Dave, even though I've listened to a lot of these things? First, please, after having listened to me talk for 60 minutes or 58 or something like that, give yourself a little bit of self-compassion. I know you might feel guilty for things that you're doing based on the media narratives you hear around screens. I know you might feel anxiety about whether or not you're doing something that is messing up your child. We all feel that. I'm married to a psychologist. I am a psychologist. And still, what I tell people is all my training has made it so that I still parent on instinct. And then maybe my rebound is better because at least I can consider my training on the rebound. But at the end of the day, we all have to give ourselves some grace and try each day to show up to be the parent that we're trying to be and that we want our kid to experience for them. So as you're navigating all these things, give yourself a break. Secondly, go back to that slide on critical developmental tasks. Ask yourself that checklist. Before you focus on only tech, focus on those things and think about tech as it falls into that context. As I emphasized in the last slide, be your kid's guide and ally in digital literacy. We have to build up so many technological competencies in the modern age. And to try to put our heads in the sand is maybe not necessarily the most effective way to deal with it. So the best thing we can do at some level is lean into our kids' worlds, try to understand them, try to map the risks, and try to set appropriate boundaries. Be familiar with the risk factors. A lot of the things I've outlined here were just introduction to those things. There's a lot more reading in the resources that I've included in this presentation. Please make sure that you understand those risks and have ways that you feel like you can talk to kids about them. As I've said throughout this presentation, focus on the practical, not the panic, and help your kids to think critically about technology. If you are an educator, what I would really consider with your educator community, we have a lot of conversations like this with schools around the country. Consider how technology either adds to or distracts from education. There are many conversations across the country right now about phone bans in school. That makes logical sense. Kids being on their phones during school is, pretty obviously distracting and might not allow them to engage with their education, but there is a lot of other tech in education right now and a lot of other research needed to show whether or not it helps outcomes or distracts from them. Continue to encourage, as a community, guiding discussion of digital literacy. I always say to teachers, I don't love the fact that we as a society put almost everything on schools, whether it's learning civil discourse, whether it's sex ed, whether it's understanding drugs and alcohol, all kinds of things like that. We put curricula everywhere in our schools. Consider what we're teaching kids about digital literacy and consider about how we're preparing them to be students in the kind of digital age. The more we can guide that from elementary school years on, the better, as we ask really tough questions in partnership with our community and the parents and the PTA at our schools. I would also emphasize that bullying research in real life in schools shows that if you get kids with high social cachet, kids who are popular, to upstand on behalf of those who are victimized, you combat bullying. Think about that notion in real life and in online spaces. Again, go back to the developmental tasks slide that I showed and consider those things in context and consider the health of kids in our community. And lastly, AI is going to change the world faster than we know it. And so predicting these tech trends and how they are going to figure into school curriculum, trying to stay ahead of them, that is going to be a challenge of the 21st century. In terms of communities, as a last slide, I will just say, and I think you all have heard this from me, there's a yes and here. So in other words, say yes to perhaps, and. If your community is engaged in a delay movement, delaying phones until 8th grade, delaying social media until 16, things like that, remember what I said about not being able to wake up, being able to drive at 16. You still need to learn about these worlds before you get to a place where you access them. No one wakes up at 16 knowing how to navigate Instagram. No one wakes up in 8th grade knowing how to use a phone. So we've got to figure out how to kind of yes and those two things. Continue to advocate for transparency from technology companies. And the last thought that I'll leave you with before I move to questions is that if you are supporting mental health and you have a policymaker or legislator in your community, in your town, in your state, at the federal level, who is saying that they want to hold technology companies accountable and make sure to hold social media accountable for the risks that it poses to youth? Absolutely. And please help us reduce stigma. Please help us make it so kids will talk about them struggling. Please help us get prevention curricula into schools. Please help us make sure our kids have access to mental health services when they need it, and that they're covered by their insurance, that we have enough mental health professionals in the treatment deserts that 160 million people are privy to across this country. Please make sure there is crisis support in our communities that is informed by mental health training, and that makes sure to try to de-escalate kids who are having a mental health crisis. Please make sure that the care that kids receive, the care that is going in our communities, is community-centered, is inclusive of the various factors that are going on in that community, is culturally centered, is engaged in by representative members of the community, all of those things. Please make sure youth are included, that we ask youth about what they need, that we include them in policy discussions that are being developed for them, nothing for them without them, and that they are engaged. And please also consider the fact that no one is healthy who does not have their basic needs provided for. If people are hungry in your community, if people are unsafe in your community, if people don't know where their next dollar is coming from and don't know how they're going to be able to pay rent or pay for their heat this month, or if they don't have the ability to get themselves medical care, it's going to be really difficult to find mental health, regardless of the presence of screens in their lives. So that's where we want to make sure that if we are spending effort on this problem as a country, we are not just thinking that Instagram and putting boundaries on that is the solution. We are thinking about it as an entire landscape. So with that, I'll move to some moderated questions, and let's do this.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. That was amazing. What a wide lens you put on the technology issue for us. We've already had a parent say they're going to turn their phone off while they're at home with their kiddos. So
that's good to hear. Yeah. I put mine in another room for most of the weekend.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Let them see you, not be distracted by the phone.
Yeah.
And like less time is good for our mental health as well.
Don't get me wrong. I am still bored drawing a rainbow. I'm sorry, Olivia. I'm still bored drawing a rainbow for an hour with my 6-year-old, but I know that time is meaningful to her, and the phone next to us would only distract from it.
Yes. I did want to let the audience know while they're on this slide too, there's a pop-up that they can indicate if they're interested in the Child Mind Institute newsletter. And so feel free to fill that out while we're going through some questions.
Yes, we'll be cycling through these slides. So there's a QR code here for the Child Mind Institute newsletter. We're also going to be sending these out where you can see links to all of our socials, even as I discussed the risks of social media, our podcast, even as I discussed that as a digital activity. And at the same time, we've got links to resources from all of our partners here. Sorry.
Yeah, that's excellent. Was there one more slide that you needed to cover for Child Mind Institute? Because we could do that now too. I think
nothing else there. I think it's submitting questions and Operation Parent.
Okay, yeah, we got it. Good deal. So we do have a good bit of questions already in. You're welcome to continue to submit your questions if you haven't already. And I'm going to quickly tell everyone just a little bit about Operation Parent. So our Operation Parent handbooks are helping parents navigate today's toughest parenting topics, like social media, as you talked a lot about today, and technology, gaming, vaping, bullying, opioids, mental health, and so much more. They're designed for every caregiver, foster parents, and grandparents. We have an elementary version and a middle and high school version that will provide age-appropriate guidance, practical conversation starters. Dr. Anderson, we're big on the conversations here at Operation Parent. And you can click on the pop-up to explore our elementary and middle high school handbooks. They're available in standard, Spanish, Christian, and so we hope that you'll enjoy shopping and looking at those handbooks and finding them useful for your individual families. You can get a copy today to equip yourself or someone that you care about with tools to spark meaningful and informed conversations at your home. So they're very affordable, elementary $9.99, middle and high $14.99. And we also invite you to come to our upcoming webinars. So one in December, one more to close out the year, and then we'll come right back in January with Growing Minds and Modern Highs. All right, excellent. So into the questions. So one of our viewers has a state law in their area, no phones during school, bell to bell.
Mhm.
And they have a teen that they're working with that they advocate that the teen is advocating that she can't interact with her in-person friends without her phone. She's got tons of interests and talents. How can I help her navigate those in-person interactions so that they're not relying on showing each other memes and things like that?
I mean, my initial thing is I have a poster on my wall behind me here that I would, if I was meeting with this teen that you advocate for, show them, which is thinking traps. And what I would identify with that teenager is the notion of all or nothing thinking. So I want to validate, first of all, the fact that friendships are incredibly important at this age, that I can understand why that person's peers are one of the most important considerations in her life. And that beyond that, no one is saying that we can't interact with our friends in that way all the time. No one is saying you can't interact outside of school hours or at moments when it might be inappropriate. And that could be a very clear, anchor point in your relationship. But we need to kind of move away from the all or nothing thinking to perhaps saying, okay, look, it is a state law though. This is not a rule I can advocate for you on. Like there's a sort of serenity prayer here and God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. If it was just a rule that your math teacher has, I can understand why we might want to talk to them about this kind of advocacy. But this is a state law. So this is a serenity prayer. We're going to say to ourselves, we know your phone can't be out. So let's try to brainstorm together just the ways that you can connect with your in-person friends during this time. Now, first of all, most of it is going to be in class. I'm going to expect that we've got how much time? A couple minutes between classes, a little bit of side conversation at one point during class, that kind of stuff. What do those interactions look like? Can we collect data from other kids? Can we look at how they have conversations or they interact? I'm going to help you maintain these friendships, but we're also going to talk back a little bit to our brain when our brain tells us this is the only way that things can happen. That's how I would confront that one.
Yeah, that's awesome. Empower them to think about it a little bit differently.
Yeah.
So you started giving us some really great examples, and you sprinkled them all throughout your presentation of the good ways that you're using technology in your home. Sure. You mentioned the movie time on the weekend as well as the cello YouTube videos. Yeah. Can you give us a couple more examples that are working for you in your house of good screen time?
Well, sure. So I think that I commonly will think of it as kind of good tech time in the sense that I'm looking at technology that facilitates bonding, the exploration of interests, education, learning, social connection, things like that. So in my mind, if we're bringing technology into our house, I want it to amplify those things. So we are commonly in dialogue with a device on our kitchen counter that helps us to listen to music through apps like Spotify, Apple Music, or Amazon Music. I'm trying not to promote any particular service here, but the bottom line is we're exploring music. We'll play songs for each other. We'll play Taylor Swift's latest album, or my son has recently gotten really into Metallica after he found out the Virginia Tech football team enters their stadium to enter Sandman. So we're thinking about how that brings us together and also prepares us perhaps for road trips around this. And almost everything that I gave as an example on that kind of technology-based activity slide has kind of an aspect of it that can be bonding in the sense that we can do design-based activities where my daughter and I the other day were designing a color by numbers unicorn using a particular app that she can then color by in real life. And we can kind of be engaging in art, which also helps with her fine motor control. We think about what we watch as TV shows or movies and what kind of content we're exposed to and, what we think is kind of appropriate. My son has gotten into a habit of saying whether or not he believes a TV show or movie is appropriate for him to watch with my daughter or without, since he's at a slightly different developmental stage. My daughter really likes going and looking at photos on my wife or my phone because they're the most documented children in history because we love them so much. And she likes just picking a random photo from a random year and having us tell her a story about it. And you look at how her memory is constructed, and so much of it is her telling stories that she was not present for. Well, not she wasn't present for, she was usually present, but she also doesn't really have an explicit memory of, but she remembers how the story was told. And this has become, Daddy, tell me a story about an animal. Daddy, tell me a story about when I did something funny. And we'll kind of go to photos to kind of look at that. we definitely read the news through some digital means, or we'll listen to like kid-friendly podcasts about the news as a way of like learning about the world. Like our kids will ask like, what's going on with this war, or what's going on with this, and we're like wanting to give them answers, but also like, it's a war. Like this is a lot to talk about with kids. And so how can we help them to understand some of these real life news stories they might hear about in school, but in ways that other people have kind of done the work for us, where my wife and I might listen to it beforehand and then kind of bring it back to them. And the last thing I'll go to is that our kids often, if we are ordering delivery, will interact with the food app with us and see how that happens, because we're preparing them for that, or they'll track where our ride share is coming from, or they'll use a digital calendar to look at what our family schedule is for the weekend, where my wife and I each have our Google calendars saved on our phone, and I can say, look, click on the day and let's check out what's going on and talk logistics, and they can kind of help us map that schedule. So that's just me free associating with. There's a lot of stuff that like you can help in building digital literacy, but also think about using it for education, learning, and connection.
That's really awesome, because you're pumping them up to get excited for their time with you, something to look forward to on the weekends, and showing them, the scheduling skill is huge.
And preparing them that if mommy and daddy are going to an adult Halloween party this past weekend and they're going to be with a babysitter, they at least could plan out for that and know that we're going to play football catch and go to Target before that happens.
Yes. So make the most of it when you have that time, right?
Yes.
So speaking of podcasts being a great use for kids listening to kid-friendly podcasts, I think they're a great use for us as professionals. And we have a lot of counselors, clinical folks on the call. I know I'm a big fan of podcasts. I'm a very big fan of your newer podcast.
Thanks.
So I really want the audience to tune into that podcast, because it's real. What you're doing with that is incredible.
Thank you.
It's really easy to listen to, and you just have a lot of takeaways and things to think about in your own parenting, as well as just if you're an executive director of a drug-free community or whatever you do professionally. There's so many takeaways in the way that you're framing up your podcast. So thank you for putting that out into the world. It's amazing.
Thank you. And look, for those of you who are looking for this, I'll just say our podcast is Thriving Kids. And the way that it's structured is that, and here's a slide, right? The way that it's structured is each week we have a guest. It's either someone, it might be another CMI clinician talking about a tough topic like grief or, death or loss. It might be somebody talking about preparing for the holidays or back to school, or we might have an outside guest who's talking about things like upcoming podcast episodes include, I think, Mark Brackett and Melinda Wenner-Moyer and some other folks who've written key books in this space. But the focus is that each week we have a guest, and then every other week I answer listener submitted questions. So if anybody is worried their question in this Operation Parent webinar is not getting answered, you can submit it to us in our podcast and we'll answer it. And just in the notion of other podcasts I really love, my guest last week, Lisa D'Amour, has a podcast that she does every week with questions submitted by parents herself. And then I'll also say my good friend, Dr. Eliza Pressman, also has a fantastic podcast called Raising Good Humans that really delves into a lot of these topics in long form. So those are some of the ones I listen to.
Yeah, we love both of those podcasts, Lisa's and Elisa's here at Operation Parent too. I'm glad you mentioned those. Would you be comfortable saying what you recommend parents use to monitor their children's apps, or just general philosophy around that, what you're thinking?
Yeah, I will say that I don't think that any monitoring software is necessarily perfect. And the reality is that, like, I don't want a monitoring software, and this I think is aligned with Operation Parent. I don't think that any monitoring software really is a replacement for the conversations that need to be had. Because at the end of the day, it's a tool for setting and keeping boundaries. But at the same time, there's so much the kids need to understand and learn together about how to navigate the digital world that just bounding that world may not necessarily help you all that much. So, we generally will see, software in wide use like Bark or Aura or RPact, things like that. Some families will find ways to use screen time, though, as I've said to many families, if you built the product that is meant to keep people's eyes on it for as long as possible, it's also difficult to believe that you would then build the product that is most meant to keep eyes off of it. I'm sure many of you have also seen things like Brick, as a way that, people place boundaries around screen time, which is kind of a device that can be centered in the house, and you can kind of scan the phone and then lock it down based off of that particular device. I'll also say that, I think that with many parents who use these kinds of apps, because they're not perfect and because they may be focused on setting limits on what apps can be downloaded or how much time can be set in an app, one thing I will caution against is the apps that give you keystroke reports of everything that a child types or every text that they send. Kids need private spaces. As a teenager, I go back to this. Every conversation that I had with my friends was private. It didn't live online. It didn't live in screenshots. I won't say that, actually. I came up in the age of America Online Instant Messenger. So there were conversations that were not private or possibly could have been screenshotted. But most of that was me just waiting online with a few of my friends until the girl I liked showed up, and maybe we had, 30 seconds of a chat. But most of the conversations that we have or we had in previous generations were private. Obviously, there's a larger fear that goes along with the digital age, that conversations can live forever, that kids can't make the same mistakes they used to in conversation, or that these things can be, forwarded to school teachers, forwarded to the parents in the community, that kind of stuff. And those are very real risks we should review with our kids. I'll often talk to our kids that, I try to think about this in my own communication. Any email I write, any text I send, I think about the fact that I don't have a grandma who's still living, but if either of my grandmothers was still alive and could read my texts and emails, I believe that they might have a slight issue with the use of swear words with some of my closest friends, but otherwise would be okay with everything I write digitally. And that's kind of the image that I keep in my mind. Where there might be something like that, but if everything we write was suddenly made public, we want to be thinking about that. If a kid, says to you, well, I want to say some things to my friends that are private, our answer is, look, I don't want to read your text conversations. I don't want to have to get the report, but please try to make sure that if you're talking about sensitive subjects or talking about something a friend wouldn't want out there, or, something where you feel like you could make a mistake in a conversation, have those conversations in real life.
I love that. Such good advice. Make your grandma proud. Right? Keep your grandma proud.
Both grandmas, man. One of them was a little bit more of a sailor sense of humor. So it's really only one grandma. But yes,
okay. That's awesome. What do you think about the teen accounts that are being introduced on several platforms? Do you find them to be helpful? Should parents have more of a peace of mind, or keep up that speculation, I guess?
That is a great question, Michelle. Keep up your vigilance.
Yeah.
Look, the reality with the teen accounts is that this is one of those things that could have been logical 5 years ago, and is only coming into play now. And while it might provide some guardrails, there's not a single teen I know or have treated that doesn't know how to get around the very guardrails that are being put in place. So keep your vigilance, because the reality is, if a teen opts in to some of these guardrails, that is fantastic. I would love to see a teen opt into it. I also have never seen a teen clinically or in real life who opts into the guardrails themselves without some level of involvement from the adults in their community. They're still curious. And it's still a phase of development where you're interested in being exposed to as much kind of new and different horizons as possible. So I think that it's one of these things where I am not in an overly congratulatory space when tech companies suddenly announce a PR coup of new safety guardrails that they put out there. It's public relations. It's not necessarily responsible just yet.
Yes, they certainly could not have thought through everything.
Yes.
Sure.
Yes. And this is to say, when I think about tech companies, I want to work with tech companies. I want tech companies to release their data openly to us. I want researchers across the country to be taking a look at this data and really see, what we're seeing about users in this. What I'm looking for from tech companies is openness and transparency. I want them to have the same big data open science model that we would have in thinking about how to make sure these spaces are safe for youth.
Exactly. Any tips on how, this is from a parent, reassure my child isn't missing out on anything since I don't allow him to use Roblox?
Yeah, we don't allow our kid to use Roblox.
He's really missing out. So yes.
We allow our child to play Roblox with other kids on play dates, but otherwise not. And that's only in the last year or so. The reality is, most of the stuff they're doing in Roblox is not something I'm terribly concerned about. It's more about the fact that when we talk to police officers and FBI agents, as my wife and I do as we crisscross the country talking about this topic, one of the things they say in no uncertain terms is that chat rooms for young kids are where predators are hanging out. And so that's not something that we're willing to allow our kids to be exposed to at a young age. So, if there's a game that does not have any way of contact with strangers or having chat rooms, we're much more likely to kind of feel safe about it. But that's kind of the difficulty with like these interwoven games. And I'll also say that like you don't have to necessarily do as we say or do as we do. Every parent is going to make different decisions about what is going to be safe for their kid. And I think there's real value, and I'm channeling my own father and mother here, in not being the most liberal parent on the block in terms of boundaries. So, when I look at, any group of kids and the kind of the distribution of parent permissiveness, if you find yourself as the most permissive parent, I would think about rethinking your approach, because that tends to be something where, your kid might be really excited about that level of permissiveness, but at the same time, that can be a real risk for them being in spaces where they're engaging with other kids in risky behaviors who are not terribly well monitored. So at the end of the day, I'm okay with my kids thinking that, my boundaries are at some level a little draconian or leaving them out of stuff. And perhaps one day they might confront these questions themselves.
And it's okay if you've heard something on this webinar that makes you want to change how you've done something before.
Absolutely.
Like if your child is on Roblox now and you want to reconsider that, it's your privilege to do that. And like the number of predators on Roblox is massive. And so do some of your homework on that and take a look at it and what's happening with the predators that are on Roblox. So, I invite you to take some of this advice that Dr. Anderson has given us today and rework some things in your own home. As a parent, I could think of many opportunities to do that as my girls are growing up and as they still are in college.
Right. Or if everything I've said, you're sitting there being like, check, check, check. I am doing all of it. Just give yourself an enormous pat on the back and celebrate, because you may be navigating this better than any of us.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd probably go as far to say as parents will make some adjustments based on what you were saying.
Yeah.
Like diet, hydration, all of us could do better with our sleep, everything.
There's not a single thing that I myself do not have thoughts, even as I talk about this, related to even the last 2 weeks with my own children, where I don't think my wife and I should probably talk about that again. Like we seem to have lost a little bit of the thread on that particular one, but this other stuff, here's where we are.
Yeah, hopefully we can all self-reflect and adjust screen time and daily habits.
Yes,
right?
for all of our children's wellness across the country.
Because when they watch us do that well, it does impact them so positively.
Absolutely.
They're gonna do what we do more than what we say, right?
Yeah.
These are such great questions. We have, I believe, hit most of them. There were quite a few, so if I missed anyone's question, I do apologize for that. But I think we've done great here.
And I will just say that to the parents who've asked certain questions, like about tantrums or things like that, in the chat, which I know there was a very large question about kind of multiple children tantrums, I will just refer you to the fact that childmind.org has many articles on that, references about behavioral parent coaching and its approach, as well as podcasts outlining it. In fact, our very first podcast episode ever will be really helpful with that question. So don't think we're trying to leave you in the lurch. Resources exist in handbooks like those in Operation Parent, our website, the podcast, everything.
Yeah, that's right. And you have 4 additional handouts that you can read on your own time. So we chose the ones, should you monitor your teens' social media? These are all linked directly to the Child Mind Institute website. So as you're looking at those, you're going to go find them and then find many other things of value the neurodivergent kids and screen time, how to set limits on screen time, and the complete guide to teenagers and sleep.
Nice.
Yeah. I don't think we talked about this yet, and I know if it's not a question, it's on parents' mind.
Yeah.
How do you feel about phones in the bedrooms at night?
Get them out for everybody.
Yes.
I don't just mean kids, everybody.
Yes.
There's no reason to have a phone in the bedroom at night. When I think about, previous generation, I had a landline in my house growing up and a few portable phones, and we did not have a phone next. Obviously this is calling, which many of the kids don't really do. We did not have a phone next to any human who was sleeping. I don't see any reason why we would need one in this day and age. You need sleep. You need your sleep hygiene to not be dependent on a phone as much as you can. Even if your kid needs to go to sleep while listening to something or listening to music, or they need a sound machine or they need an alarm, there are non-phone solutions for almost everything that a kid can tell you about why they need it in their room. So the more we can help them sleep without phones, the more we can help ourselves sleep without phones, the better.
Yeah, that's awesome. And that's oftentimes when they're going down some dark holes as well at night when you're not with them. So that's great advice.
Yeah,
to
absolutely.
Close on. That's wonderful advice to close on. We appreciate everything you do for families every day to help.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you to all of you who've listened this far.
Our pleasure. Thanks so much. And parents, we just want you to know you've got this, and Operation Parent and Child Mind Institute have got you on the journey. Thanks so much.